There is a fundamental difference between winning a war and winning the peace. In June 2026, the world watched as a historic memorandum of understanding was announced between the United States and Iran. The headlines were immediate. The declarations were bold. From Washington, the message was clear and uncompromising. The conflict that had gripped the early months of the year was over. The Strait of Hormuz would remain open to global shipping, and American deterrence had been successfully restored. It was packaged as a masterstroke of diplomacy backed by overwhelming force. A victory. But geopolitics is rarely about what is said at a podium. Geopolitics is about geography, leverage, and the cold, hard realities of the map. And when you strip away the press conferences, the carefully worded statements, and the political theater, the map tells a vastly different story. What if I told you that the very agreement being celebrated as a strategic triumph actually conceded the most critical geographical advantages in the region? What if the ceasefire didn't neutralize the threat, but instead legitimized a new sphere of influence that adversaries have been trying to secure for decades? Today, we are going to look past the official narrative. We are going to analyze the exact terms of the 2026 U.S.-Iran peace deal, the geographical shifts that occurred while the world was distracted by the promise of open shipping lanes, and the hidden realities that defense analysts and military strategists are quietly discussing behind closed doors. Because when you zoom out and look at the actual borders, the military deployments, and the economic backdoors that were quietly opened, you realize something unsettling. The United States might have won the headlines, but Iran may have just won the map. To understand what actually happened, we have to go back to the core trigger of the conflict. In early 2026, the escalation reached a boiling point. Precision strikes by the U.S. and Israel targeted key Iranian facilities, and Iran retaliated with a calculated demonstration of asymmetric warfare. The global markets panicked. The immediate fear wasn't just a prolonged regional war, it was the economic devastation that would follow if the Strait of Hormuz, the vital artery through which a massive percentage of the world's oil flows, was choked off entirely. This was the ultimate leverage, and it is exactly where the illusion of victory begins. The primary selling point of the June agreement was the reopening and securing of the Strait. American leadership pointed to this as the ultimate concession from Tehran. The Strait is open to all, the administration declared. Global energy markets breathed a collective sigh of relief. Oil prices stabilized. From a purely economic standpoint, it looked like a definitive win for the global order. But look closer at the geography of the Strait of Hormuz. Securing a waterway does not mean you have neutralized the power that borders it. By agreeing to a 60-day ceasefire and a cessation of military operations in exchange for this maritime security, the U.S. effectively agreed to halt the degradation of Iran's coastal defense infrastructure. Iran didn't lose the ability to threaten the Strait. They simply agreed to pause the threat in exchange for time. And in military strategy, time is often the most valuable commodity of all. While American naval assets pivot to maintain the security of the shipping lanes, Iranian forces are granted a crucial window to reconstitute, redeploy, and reinforce their anti-access/area denial capabilities along the coastline. The threat wasn't eliminated. It was paused. I want to know what you think about this specific tactic. Do you believe that securing a waterway temporarily is worth halting military momentum, or does it just delay an inevitable conflict? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, because this is a debate that is currently tearing military think tanks apart. Now, let's move the map westward, away from the Persian Gulf and toward the Mediterranean. This is where the true strategic realignment is happening, largely unnoticed by the general public. The agreement included a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. On the surface, peace in the Levant sounds like a diplomatic achievement. But in the context of the broader geopolitical chess match, what does a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon actually achieve for the key players involved? For decades, Iran's forward defense strategy has relied on maintaining a contiguous land bridge, a crescent of influence stretching from Tehran, through Baghdad and Damascus, all the way to Beirut and the Mediterranean Sea. The conflict in early 2026 threatened to sever this bridge. Israeli and U.S. strikes were systematically dismantling the logistical networks that allowed this projection of power. By accepting a ceasefire across this specific geography, the U.S. inadvertently froze the map at a moment when Iranian proxies still maintained significant operational depth. The agreement didn't force a withdrawal of these proxy forces, it simply mandated a halt to the fighting. Imagine you are playing chess, and your opponent has managed to place their pieces deep into your side of the board. If a referee suddenly blows a whistle and says no more pieces can be captured, who benefits? The player who is about to clear the board, or the player whose pieces are now permanently stationed in enemy territory? Israel understands this reality perfectly. While Washington celebrates the stabilization of global oil prices, strategic planners in Tel Aviv are looking at a map where hostile forces are entrenched on their northern border, legitimized by an international ceasefire agreement that prevents preemptive action. The tactical strikes that were meant to push the threat back have been halted, leaving a status quo that heavily favors the long-term strategic goals of Tehran. This brings us to the most complex and perhaps the most consequential aspect of the deal: the economic backdoor. A ceasefire is rarely just a cessation of violence. It is a transactional arrangement. In exchange for the security of the Strait of Hormuz and the pause in regional hostilities, Iran is expected to receive significant sanctions relief and access to billions of dollars in previously frozen assets. The official narrative suggests that this money is tied to compliance, that it will be strictly monitored, and that it provides the necessary leverage to force Iran into broader technical negotiations regarding its nuclear program. It sounds logical in a briefing room, but the reality of international finance and regional influence is far messier. When billions of dollars flow into a heavily sanctioned economy, money becomes fungible. Even if specific funds are earmarked for humanitarian or civilian use, they free up domestic revenue that can be redirected toward military and strategic objectives. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a historical pattern. But it's more than just the money itself. The sanctions relief signals a shift in the global posture toward Tehran. It tells the international community, specifically eager trading partners in Asia and back-channel facilitators in Europe, that the wall of economic isolation is cracking. Once that perception takes hold, the informal economy expands rapidly. Illicit oil sales increase. Gray market technology transfers accelerate. The United States traded hard, immediate military pressure for the promise of future diplomatic negotiations. But history has repeatedly shown that in the Middle East, facts on the ground dictate the terms of diplomacy, not the other way around. If you're finding this analysis of the map and the hidden layers of geopolitical strategy valuable, take a second to hit the like button. It helps signal that we need to keep decoding these complex narratives that the mainstream headlines miss. Let's look at the broader regional perspective. The Middle East is a delicate ecosystem of alliances and rivalries. How do the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, view this victory? For years, the Gulf states have relied on the implicit guarantee of the American security umbrella. They allowed U.S. military bases on their soil and aligned their foreign policies with Washington's broader strategic goals, all based on the understanding that the U.S. would decisively counter any existential threat from across the Persian Gulf. The 2026 agreement, and specifically the reduction of U.S. military assets in the region that followed, sends a chilling message to these capitals. It suggests that American commitment is conditional, driven more by domestic political fatigue and the immediate need to stabilize energy markets than by a long-term commitment to regional security architecture. When your primary security guarantor signals that they are eager to exit the theater, you don't wait for them to pack their bags. You start looking for new arrangements. We are already seeing the early signs of this geopolitical hedging. Gulf nations are accelerating their diplomatic outreach to China and Russia, seeking to diversify their security partnerships. They are engaging in direct bilateral talks with Tehran, attempting to manage the threat locally because they no longer trust the distant superpower to do it for them. This is the hidden cost of the victory. By prioritizing a short-term, headline-friendly exit from the immediate crisis, the U.S. is accelerating the multipolar fragmentation of the Middle East. The map isn't just shifting. The entire gravitational pull of the region is changing. And what about the nuclear question? The agreement touts that Iran has reaffirmed its commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty and will enter technical negotiations. But what does that actually mean in practice? It means the U.S. has accepted a reality where Iran remains a threshold state. By agreeing to talks rather than demanding verifiable dismantlement as a precondition for relief, the administration has implicitly acknowledged that the military option to remove the nuclear infrastructure is off the table, at least for now. This is the ultimate paradox of the deal. the United States claimed victory by avoiding a war it did not want to fight, but in doing so, it conceded the very strategic objectives that the war was ostensibly meant to achieve. This is why looking at the map is so crucial. When you map out the zones of influence, the location of proxy forces, the flow of newly unfrozen capital, and the shifting alliances of the Gulf states, the picture that emerges is not one of American dominance. It is a picture of an Iranian regime that absorbed a tactical military blow, endured the pressure, and emerged on the other side with its forward defense network intact, its economy revitalized, and its primary adversary pivoting away from the region. In the grand chessboard of global strategy, this is known as a strategic retreat masked as a tactical victory. The domestic political situation in the United States played a massive role in this outcome. The war, though relatively brief, was costly. The American public has grown deeply skeptical of prolonged entanglements in the Middle East. The administration knew that a protracted conflict would be politically disastrous, especially with economic pressures mounting at home. The agreement was designed to be consumed domestically. We opened the Strait. We brought our assets home. We avoided World War III. It is a compelling narrative for voters, but adversaries don't vote in American elections. They operate on a different timeline. They measure success not in election cycles, but in decades. Do you think domestic politics should dictate foreign policy to this extent, or is it the responsibility of leadership to maintain strategic depth even when it's unpopular? Drop your perspective in the comments. This intersection of domestic pressure and foreign policy is exactly where empires make their most critical mistakes. So, where does this leave the map of the Middle East moving forward into the late 2020s? We are entering a period of dangerous ambiguity. The official war is over, but the shadow war is about to escalate significantly. With conventional military options temporarily constrained by the ceasefire agreement, the conflict will move entirely into the gray zone. Expect to see a massive increase in cyber warfare as both sides attempt to degrade each other's infrastructure without triggering a formal breach of the agreement. Expect to see the proxy forces in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen quietly rearming, funded by the newly released assets, preparing for the inevitable collapse of the diplomatic framework. Israel, feeling increasingly isolated by the American pivot, will likely accelerate its own unilateral covert operations. The timeline for a preemptive strike on nuclear facilities hasn't been erased. It has simply been decentralized. Tel Aviv will no longer wait for Washington's green light. And what of the United States? The reduction of military assets in the region is a signal that the strategic focus is shifting elsewhere, likely toward the Indo-Pacific. But the Middle East has a way of violently pulling empires back in just when they think they have successfully escaped. By leaving the foundational issues unresolved, the proxy networks, the ballistic missile programs, the threshold nuclear capabilities, the U.S. has all but guaranteed that it will have to return to this theater. Only next time, the adversary will be better funded, better entrenched, and operating in a region that has already begun to hedge its bets with other global powers. If you are committed to understanding the deep mechanics of global power, to looking past the press briefings and seeing the hidden fractures in our world order, then make sure you subscribe to Fault Lines. We don't do surface-level news. We decode the map. Hit the subscribe button and join the community of thinkers who demand the full picture. The story of the 2026 U.S.-Iran agreement will be written about in history books as a masterclass in the illusion of victory. It teaches us that you can win the battle for the news cycle while simultaneously losing the battle for the continent. It teaches us that geography is unforgiving. You cannot negotiate away physical proximity. You cannot sanction away a land bridge once it has been established, and you cannot declare a region secure simply because you have decided to look away from it. As the dust settles on this conflict, the Iranian leadership will not be looking at the American headlines declaring victory. They will be looking at the map. They will see their proxies holding the line in the Levant. They will see their coastal defenses remaining a potent threat to global shipping. They will see the Gulf states recalibrating their alliances. And they will see a timeline that works entirely in their favor. True geopolitical intelligence requires the ability to hold two conflicting ideas in your mind at the same time. The United States successfully prevented a global economic catastrophe by opening the Strait of Hormuz. That is a fact. But the United States also traded long-term strategic dominance for short-term tactical relief. That is also a fact. The tragedy of modern statecraft is that the consequences of these deals are rarely felt by the leaders who sign them. They are felt years later by the soldiers who have to return to the theater, by the regional allies who are left vulnerable, and by a world that suddenly realizes the map has fundamentally changed. The next time a historic peace deal is announced, the next time a leader steps to a podium to declare victory, do not listen to the words. Look at the map. Look at who holds the ground. Look at where the money is flowing. Look at who benefits from the passage of time, because in the end, the map never lies. And right now, the map is telling us that the war for the Middle East didn't end in 2026. It just entered its most dangerous phase yet. Stay vigilant, keep questioning the narrative, and always check the fault lines. We'll see you in the next analysis. Let's dive even deeper into the specific mechanics of what happens when conventional warfare is frozen by a diplomatic agreement. Because the war doesn't actually stop. It simply morphs into a form that is harder for the international community to track, and even harder for a superpower to combat. Welcome to the era of the hyper-advanced gray zone. When the 2026 agreement mandated a cessation of hostilities, it created a paradox. It made the open use of precision-guided munitions, naval blockades, and airstrikes politically unviable. But it did absolutely nothing to address the asymmetric networks that have been the true source of regional instability for the last 20 years. Consider the technological reality of the modern battlefield. We are no longer living in an era where power is solely defined by the number of aircraft carriers you can park in the Persian Gulf. Power is now increasingly defined by deniability. With billions of dollars of newly unfrozen capital flowing into the Iranian economy, military strategists anticipate a massive, unprecedented investment in autonomous drone swarms, advanced cyber warfare capabilities, and untraceable financial networks. Why build a billion-dollar destroyer that can be tracked by satellite and targeted by a cruise missile when you can invest a fraction of that cost into a decentralized network of autonomous, low-flying drones that can cripple critical infrastructure without a clear return address? This is the hidden genius of accepting the 2026 ceasefire from Tehran's perspective. By pausing the conventional conflict, they effectively forced the United States to fight on a battlefield where American technological supremacy is significantly diluted. Let's look at the cyber domain. The agreement explicitly focuses on physical hostilities, the movement of ships, the firing of missiles, the deployment of troops. But a modern nation-state doesn't need to fire a single missile to cripple an adversary's economy. With the threat of immediate, overwhelming kinetic retaliation temporarily removed by the diplomatic framework, cyber operators in Tehran are essentially given a green light to escalate their campaigns against Gulf infrastructure, European financial institutions, and American logistical networks. If a cyber attack takes down the power grid of a major allied city, or disrupts the water supply, or scrambles the financial data of a regional banking hub, is that a violation of the ceasefire? Historically, the answer is usually no. It's too difficult to attribute, too murky to justify breaking a major international agreement, and too politically risky to use as a pretext for war. The U.S. will be forced into a defensive posture, playing an endless game of whack-a-mole against a decentralized, well-funded adversary that is utilizing the very economic relief provided by the agreement to fund its cyber operations. And then there is the internal political dynamic within Iran itself. To understand the full scope of this geopolitical maneuver, you have to look at the domestic pressure the Iranian regime was facing prior to the agreement. The economy was staggering under the weight of maximum pressure sanctions. Inflation was rampant. Domestic unrest was a constant simmering threat, occasionally boiling over into open protests that required massive security crackdowns to contain. The military escalation in early 2026 was, in many ways, a gamble. It was a test of American resolve, but it was also a massive risk to the regime's survival. A full-scale war could have shattered their domestic control. But look at what the peace deal achieved internally. By forcing the United States to the negotiating table and securing the release of billions in frozen assets, the regime achieved a massive domestic victory. They didn't just survive the American military pressure, they capitalized on it. The narrative broadcast internally is one of resistance and triumph. The regime can point to the ceasefire and the economic relief as proof that their strategy of asymmetric resilience works. The influx of capital allows them to stabilize the economy, placate the populace through subsidies, and solidify their internal power structure. The U.S., in its desperation to secure the Strait of Hormuz and exit the immediate crisis, handed the Iranian regime the very lifeline it desperately needed to secure its domestic survival for the next decade. This is the tragedy of asymmetrical negotiations. The United States approached the 2026 agreement as a problem of military de-escalation and economic stabilization. They wanted to fix the immediate crisis. Iran approached the negotiation as a problem of regime survival and long-term regional positioning. They wanted to secure the future. When one side negotiates for tomorrow, and the other side negotiates for the next decade, the long-term winner is always the latter. This disparity in strategic timelines is the fundamental flaw in Western foreign policy. Democracies are inherently disadvantaged in long-term geopolitical struggles because their strategies are constantly interrupted by election cycles. A policy that makes perfect strategic sense for a 10-year horizon might be political suicide in an election year. The 2026 agreement was, first and foremost, a political calculation by the U.S. administration. The optics of a historic peace deal are incredibly powerful on a debate stage. The reality of a fortified proxy network in Lebanon or a heavily funded cyber warfare unit in Tehran are too abstract, too distant, and too complex to sway the average voter. But geopolitics doesn't care about election cycles. The map doesn't reset when a new administration takes office. The geographic and economic realities locked in by this agreement will outlast the politicians who signed it. And this is why the role of the Gulf states is so critical to monitor in the coming years. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and their regional partners are not constrained by 4-year election cycles. They are looking at the next 50 years, and what they see is a United States that is structurally incapable of providing the long-term, unconditional security guarantees that underpinned the region for the last half-century. The pivot to Asia is no longer just a theoretical policy paper. It is a physical reality demonstrated by the reduction of U.S. assets following the 2026 deal. So, what does a multipolar Middle East actually look like? It looks like Saudi Arabia purchasing advanced autonomous drone technology from China. It looks like the UAE expanding its naval partnerships with India. It looks like a complex web of bilateral non-aggression pacts, back-channel economic agreements, and localized security architectures that explicitly exclude Washington. The U.S. claimed victory by stepping back from the brink of war. But in stepping back, they created a vacuum. And in geopolitics, vacuums are never empty for long. The irony is that by trying to stabilize the Middle East through a rapid, headline-driven peace agreement, the United States may have inadvertently accelerated the very destabilization it was trying to prevent. A region that was once rigidly structured around an American security umbrella is now a free-for-all. Every nation is scrambling to secure its own borders, arm its own militaries, and forge its own alliances in anticipation of the day when the U.S. is no longer there to play referee. And sitting at the center of this newly chaotic map is Iran. Economically revived, militarily intact, geographically entrenched. They didn't win the war, but they absolutely won the peace. This is the hard truth that the mainstream analysis entirely misses. We are conditioned to look for explosions, for troop movements, for the dramatic signatures of conventional conflict. But the most decisive victories in the 21st century will not be won with aircraft carriers or cruise missiles. They will be won in the quiet rooms where diplomatic agreements are signed. They will be won by the nations that understand how to leverage geography, time, and the impatience of their adversaries. The 2026 U.S.-Iran peace deal is a masterclass in exactly that. It is a monument to the illusion of victory. So, I challenge you to look beyond the official statements. Look beyond the partisan talking points. Look at the map. Because the map is the only thing that matters. And the map is telling us that the world has fundamentally changed. The old order is gone. The new era of geopolitical fragmentation has arrived, and the true cost of this victory is only just beginning to reveal itself. Stay alert. Keep decoding the narrative. And remember that the fault lines are always shifting beneath your feet. We'll see you in the next analysis.